First of all, I'll say that it's a pleasure to be here, and my favorite hobby is gardening. I like to grow plants. I grew up growing plants. Before the bus came in the morning, I went out and took a hoe in the springtime and hoed through the garden. My dad didn't tell me I had to do that. I enjoy doing that. Also, I enjoy eating homegrown foods. And I think the quality of growing your own, it's not just a matter of being fresh. It's a matter of you can influence the nutritional value of what you eat if you have the soil and start looking to see what that soil needs. If you think that doesn't make any difference, I had one, I think I mentioned this even yesterday, but had one dairyman in New Zealand that we started working with. And just by going in and correcting the soils in his pastures, his veterinarian bill for 1,300 cows went from 110,000 down to less than $10,000 in 1 year. If you can change the health of livestock on grass that quickly, what can you do if you also start putting the nutrients that are needed in your garden to supply what we need? Now, in growing up, I didn't know these principles. I grew up on a farm, but we just thought, put on more manure. Put on more manure, that's what you need for a garden. Or put on, we use manure, not compost, because we didn't know what composting was. I didn't really learn about composting until I went off to college. But this morning, I just want to say that in starting this business, I had a number of people that came to me and said, well, you know what you're doing, you're never going to grow that big. Because my idea was the more I could learn and share with whoever was a client, the better job they could do. And a lot of people said, when you do that, they don't need you anymore. Well, first of all, what I would say is, if we can teach people that they don't need you anymore, there's still plenty of other people out there that do. And secondly, what I found was, when you start teaching people what they need to do, they say, there's so much to remember. I need to have you make sure you help us to do this right. Because that's what I do all the time. Well, I didn't get in this to get big. I got in this because I enjoy doing it. And just the concept of saying you're willing to give as much information as possible. You know what I found out? I've learned more stuff because people find out when you're willing to share, they'll share back. That's how I learned a lot of the things that I learned today. And a lot of these solving specific problems, it was somebody who came and told me about it. So it's not a matter of having to know everything. I'm not going to go into the company history that much except to say we make our living selling advice. That's all we do. We don't sell fertilizers. Now, I'm not against people who sell fertilizers. I mean, we need them. I'm not even against people who are consultants and sell fertilizer. It's just a matter that when I started, I determined I don't want people to think I'm making a recommendation because we've got that to sell and we're trying to make money on it. I want it to be something where we promote quality, and by the educational things that we do and the benefits that they see, that stimulates them to come back. We don't call someone on the phone and say, oh, by the way, you haven't soil tested in a year or so. We don't send newsletters out. We try to teach the people the value of soil testing so that they make the decision. You're the manager and I'm an advisor. I'm not going to call anybody up and say, oh, you need to soil test again. You know why? It's easy to talk somebody into pulling a soil test. What's hard is to get them to do what they need to do to make that work. And today we're not going to talk all about that. And as a matter of fact, I put on 3-day courses to try to teach people how the fertility in soil works. And I'd do it in 3 hours if I could, but I don't know how. Actually, we have 4 different 3-day courses just to get through all the various things you have to face if you're going to be a consultant. to help other people understand. How does your garden grow? When you start looking at soils and so forth, is all of the soil the same in your garden? Does it all appear the same? If it does, then one soil sample will probably suffice. But what if you got a little corner over there and everything else is growing real well, but that corner doesn't grow so well? A lot of people say, if you want a soil sample, take an average of everything, so they'll go over and take a probe of soil out of that bad part and stick it in with the good. That just skews the sample. If you've got what to do, if you're going to take one sample, look and see which part you're most concerned with. Take that sample and send it as a separate sample. Have that analyzed and treat that, because every difference you see generally has a different mineral makeup. The different color, the different slope, the different kinds of weeds or grass that grow there, any kind of difference you see. So when we ask, how does your garden grow? You know, some people will take a sample out of their garden and the high side weedy and the low side not so weedy. Well, it's a good idea in those kind of cases to take it out of one or the other, because the part that's weedy has a different kind of nutrient makeup than the part that's not. And we see this in farmers' fields, we see this in gardens, we see this everywhere. When you see a different kind of weed or grass grow, it's because there's different nutrition in that soil. When you see a place that grows your vegetables really well, it's because the nutrition is closer in that soil than in a place where you have problems. For the first 5 years when I started this, I specialized in problem soil. That's what we worked with, because the man that trained me, Dr. William Albrecht, said, now, Neal, you're not, you know, when you go out and start consulting, whoever signs up with you, they got a problem. They might not tell you they have a problem, but they're going to have a problem. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, because the university does free soil tests. They're not going to pay you for a soil test unless they haven't gotten the answer they need. And for 5 years, I thought, woe is me. All I get's all these old problem soils. I'd like to work on some good soil. You know what? It was the best education you could have, because when you found out you could fix those problems, then you knew you could fix the other things as well. That's where, as far as I'm concerned, that's where growing is the first key. Getting something to grow, but once you get that to grow, what are you growing? Are you growing the best quality you can, or just growing something because it looks good? My aunt grew a terrific garden. I stayed with my aunt, my great aunt and great uncle. I actually rented a bedroom from them when I was going to the first 2 years of college. The garden looked great. The food tasted terrible. It was bitter. I never ate cooked turnips at home. I ate raw turnips, but she fixed cooked turnips. When I'd eat those turnips, yuck. I can't stand that stuff. It was, you know, but later on when I tasted some cooked turnips that my wife made, man, that's good. If you grow something and it doesn't taste right, there's something wrong. Just the question is, what is it? Sometimes it's too much of something. Sometimes it's too little of something. Sometimes it's both. Most of the time it's both. Now, we talked about this yesterday, but this is an optimum. If you can get a ratio in terms of, I say ratios, we don't really work on ratios, we work on percentages, but if you can get your percentage of calcium and magnesium and potassium, this is, once you get within these ranges, both soils will do its best. Sandy soil need a little bit more of magnesium versus calcium, and clay soil need more calcium versus magnesium. But if you've got a soil that falls in these ranges, on the soil test that we do, we know you're going to grow a good garden. We know you're going to grow good crops there. Magnesium deficiency, if you're below 10% on the, now, here's the problem. A soil test only gives you the way that particular laboratory has designed to do their test. In other words, what I'm saying there is, we've got all this big equipment that you got to use to do a soil test with. Well, you got to have some soil to set that equipment by, or to calibrate it by. It's like the old FM radios. Maybe, my being 80, you may not remember this, but used to, we didn't listen to FM radio very much because you always had to retune it. You'd get it on, it'd sort of drift off. And then you had to go back and tune it back in again. FM doesn't do that anymore, but it used to. Well, that's the same thing with if you're running soil tests all day, you got to calibrate those machines 2 or 3 times a day. You got to have some soil to calibrate it by, to get 0 back to 0 or 1 back to 1, whatever you might say. Every laboratory has to have a soil to do that, but there's no mandatory soil from the U.S. government that says, everybody use this soil. So when they recalibrate their machine, the numbers come out different from one soil test laboratory to another. The numbers that we have on our tests don't come the same from someplace else. It isn't that they're wrong and we're right. It's a matter that you have to know what those numbers mean when you go out onto the soil. And I was able to study under a man who used the same testing mechanisms for 50 years before I ever got to study under him. And he said, based on the test, as long as you do it this way, these are what the numbers ought to be. And he also said, and don't try to interpret that for some other soil test because you'll be wrong. And over 50 years of consulting, every time I've tried to use somebody else's soil test to tell them what to do, because somebody will come along and convince me, every time from what they did and then knowing what they should have done once we do the right test, I've been wrong every time. I wish I could read every soil test in the world, but I can't. And the soil test is what tells me what needs to be done to a soil. And I wish I could just walk out in the field and look at it and say, oh, you need to do this, this, and this. Well, you know, you can look at a problem. You can go out and look at a field and say, oh, you've got this problem. But what we can't tell you is how many pounds of whatever it is that's a problem it takes to correct that soil. Because a sandy soil is like trying to put, if you got a sandy soil, let's say that's like a cup of coffee. And you got a clay soil, it has 10 times more holding capacity, so that's like a coffee pot. All right, if it takes a teaspoon of sugar in your cup of coffee, it's going to take 10 teaspoons to do the same if you're trying to sweeten that pot of coffee. Do we have a coffee pot? Do we have a cup? Or do we have a barrel? Each one takes a different amount because it's not how many pounds you put in or how many ounces. It's what percentage of saturation you get. The percentage of sugar saturation determines how sweet it is. That's the problem in terms of we don't know when we look at a soil and say, oh, you've got a zinc deficiency. Well, do we need 10 pounds of zinc sulfate to solve that problem? Or do we need 20 pounds or do we need 35 pounds? It's not so cut and dried because, first of all, we have to know the capacity of the soil. Do you have a teacup? Do you have a coffee pot? Do you have a barrel? Once we get that, then we start looking at the percentages. We did this, we said this yesterday, and I'll put it in case some of you, I didn't know how many would be at one time and the other. Foliar magnesium for garden plants. If you wonder whether or not you have too little or too much magnesium, this is not going to hurt you. It's not going to be too much. It's not going to hurt the plants. It's just a matter of will you see a response or not. Take 1 tablespoon of Epsom salts, which is 11% magnesium. And as I explained yesterday, most soils have either too little or too much magnesium in the soil. We don't have soil that generally have the right amount. It's just a matter of that's the way the mineral content's made up. But unless you have on a clay soil 10 to 12% magnesium, if it's below 10, you're going to have a magnesium deficiency. If it's above 12, you're going to have a magnesium deficiency for 2 different reasons. When it's below 10, magnesium is deficient in the soil. When it's above 12, magnesium is so excessive, it restricts the aeration in the soil. The microbes can't do their job to get the magnesium into the plant. And you can do a plant analysis and find out that food crops are the worst at having to have this true level. And if we have more than that, we don't have enough magnesium. Well, if you don't have that situation in your garden, take a tablespoon of Epsom salts, put it in a gallon of water, use a little pump-up sprayer, go out there and spray on the leaves of your crop. We use green beans as the example because that's a real good way in a garden to find out if you're short on magnesium. If you plant green beans, they come up this tall, and they've got something start chewing holes in the leaf, whether it's a worm or a bug or whatever it is. Go out there and spray this on, and they'll quit. I mean, they'll quit. for about 2 to 3 weeks. No, sorry, for about 3 to 4 weeks. And then in 3 to 4 weeks, if you start seeing holes come in there again, it's time to go back out there and spray that same amount again. Sometimes you have to do it 3 or 4 times a year. But here's the thing. Even if you put on something that you don't see holes in the leaves, watch those plants, because in 3 days, if you're short on magnesium, they'll turn greener. I don't care how green they look. If you're short on magnesium, they're going to get greener, because that magnesium is the center of the chlorophyll, and you need the magnesium for the nitrogen to work properly to build the food for the plant. Anything that's worth doing is worth doing right. The real long-term solutions are not normally the easiest to accomplish. You have to put some effort to help even the best solutions work properly. We may be able to tell you the answer, oh, you're short on this, but then the next thing is you got to go find the right material. Because there are a lot of people that say, oh, you don't need that. And especially when it comes to micronutrients, because most people don't know how much micronutrient you need in your garden anyway. They may act like they do, but they really don't know what that soil test has to be. And if they do know what the soil test has to be, and it's not there, I've had lab chemists from laboratories come and tell me, we don't know how to tell them how many pounds they need. We just say, well, you're deficient, so put on this much, and then we test it next year, and if they're still deficient, we'll put that much more on until you finally get to where it's not deficient. A soil test that's exact can tell you how many pounds of each micronutrient you need in order to get that test to the right place. It's then a matter of finding it and putting it on. It's not hard, generally, it's not hard to find unless you need something like cobalt sulfate. Cobalt sulfate is something that some gardeners do need because cobalt is necessary for the microbes in the soil. As a matter of fact, cobalt is necessary for digestion in the body. In New Zealand, when the British first settled New Zealand, they brought their cattle over, they had grass up to the bellies of the cows. New Zealanders will still tell you this story about their ancestors. They had grass up to the belly of the cows. They said, look at all this pasture we've got. We've got a great place here to grow beef cattle or dairy or whatever. The cows would eat that grass up to their bellies and starve to death, die of starvation. As soon as they learned to put a minute amount of cobalt, ounces, we will recommend on some soils as little as 6 ounces of cobalt sulfate to the acre. And it's a good thing because it costs about $16,000 a ton. So it's expensive stuff. But on the other hand, if you need that, it's going to slow down in terms of, it's not going to kill us. We're going to go to the doctor and find out something. But in terms of just putting that minute amount of cobalt in those soils, and all of a sudden the digestion improves. I'm going to tell you this. Being a homesteading group and so forth, or gardeners. And when I first started to learn about the importance of eating good, clean foods, I was put in contact with Ernest Hallbleb at Hallbleb Orchards in McNabb, Illinois. They grew everything organic back in the 1960s and sold it through the mail. You could order cheese through the mail or whatever, where that goes. But Mr. Hallbleb did an experiment, because he grew open pollinated corn. And he said, these hybrid corns, why do they respond the way they do? Because they're bred to stand certain deficiencies in a soil. So he took several different types of hybrid corn, planted them on his farm, planted his open pollinated corn, and sent them to, at that time, the Armour Institute, and had them analyzed. And he said, the open pollinated corn came back. It had the various nutrients. He said the hybrid corn came back. Every hybrid, he said, had all the same nutrients as the open pollinated, except no cobalt. No cobalt. He said every one of the hybrids did not. Now, I'm not saying there's no hybrid today that doesn't have cobalt. Maybe they do. But he said there was no cobalt in any one of those hybrids, which you fed that corn to your livestock or whatever, you're not feeding them what they need in order to have the proper digestion. That's not, most of the time when we check cobalt in soil, they're not deficient. But one thing you can tell, and that is by working with people that grow sheep, there's a problem When cobalt gets so low in sheep, they'll get a problem with facial eczema. If your cobalt gets below 0.35 parts per million, a sheep's going to get facial eczema on the test we use. If you put enough cobalt on there to get it above 0.35, guess what? It just clears up. A lot of the diseases we have and so forth are caused, for plants and for us, are caused because we're not getting enough of something. The closer we get our nutrient levels to right, and who knows what's right? What I'll tell you is, all of the clients we work with, when we finally get everything we know how to measure to the correct parts, sometimes we'll find we want to use something broad spectrum like kelp or clay dust or rock dust or things of this nature, and you put that on, all of a sudden it goes even better because there's so many of the other elements in that soil. How much of every element on the periodic table do we need to have the right amount? I don't know. We only measure about 20. But how many of those others can make a difference if they're missing? That's why once we do everything we know to do to get that, quote, soil balanced, then you buy something that has a real broad spectrum, a small amount of 70 or 80 different nutrients in it. And that's what can make a difference in supplying those things we don't know how to measure. It isn't the matter, I think, we're able to do things perfectly. It's just a matter we're able to measure the things that make the most difference in terms of being able to come in and say, well, these things are the parts that we can measure because you need quite a lot of them. If you're growing sweet corn or tomatoes in your garden and you have a cutworm problem, you're short on calcium. I don't care what your pH is. And there'll be people, oh, no, you don't need to put any lime on there. If you have cutworms, you're short on calcium. It may only be short on calcium in the top 2 inches, because that's where the cutworm is. But we have clients who correct their calcium, and there's going to be spots in a garden or a field where the calcium's extra low, and when you correct it in the rest, there's still a place that's deficient. And guess what? That's where the cutworms will start every time. You just watch where the cutworms start, go and take a soil sample there, and what you'll find is that's where you have the least amount of available calcium in that garden. Is that pounds we're talking about? No. It's percentage. It's not pH, it's percentage. When you get that percentage up above 60%, you start to discourage the cutworm. But if you come in there and put something on that then actually ties up the calcium, that cutworm, even though you say, well, we got good calcium in this soil, is it good in the top 1 to 2 inches? And there are times when you put on some pelletized lime and you can take care of that. As a matter of fact, Dr. William Albrecht, the fellow that taught us, said, whether you've got pastures or gardens or anything else, it's a good idea to put 300 pounds of calcium limestone every year once you get it corrected. Not if you've got an excess, but once you get it, if you're deficient and you get it corrected, he said, it takes about 300 pounds of calcium carbonate lime a year just to maintain that calcium level. If you have a garden and your calcium levels measure out to be reasonable, and you start to see a cutworm, consider you might want to put 300 pounds, the equivalent of 300 pounds per acre. I can't keep this in my head. I speak a lot, but if you put on 200 pounds per acre and you've got a garden, that's 7.5 ounces per 100 square feet. Now that might sound like, oh, how can I do that? Well, you get it and mix it in with sand or some kind of a way so that you can put it in there so you can spread it. Personally, what I do is you can get a little portable cement mixer and you can put all your trace elements, and when you need these very small amounts, put them all in there and use that portable cement mixer and mix it up. Go out there and spread it on the garden. Are you going to get it exact? I just do it like that. And we'll get a little more someplace and a little less, but the thing about it is if you put materials on a soil, the microbes do work on that as well. When you grow potatoes, if it's short in copper, if the potato is short in copper, you boil a potato and you peel that, just boil it with the peeling on it, and when you take that peeling off, if you see gray spots in that potato, you've got a copper deficiency in that soil. Now, there are people that you can read who are experts on potatoes, and they'll say, oh, that's a calcium deficiency. Because when they corrected calcium, they solved the problem. That's only if you got enough copper there, because it takes the calcium to get the copper in. Most of the soils in Ohio have good calcium levels, good enough so that that's not the limiting factor. If you have less than 2 parts per million copper, that's when you'll start to see that gray in the potato. Why does that make any difference? Copper is necessary to fight rust and fungus diseases in your garden. But copper is also necessary to take care of muscle and bone inflammation in us. And you know what? Most soils in the world are deficient in copper. Almost all of them. General exceptions are people who use turkey manure or turkey compost because they supplement copper sulfate into the manure. And if you put on 4 tons of that, generally that's enough that'll take care of anybody that's used 4 tons of turkey manure will generally have good copper levels. Sometimes, most of the time, if you find good copper, it's going to be in river bottoms where the river has come along because of enough copper being put into the water from waste facilities and whatever. I'm not saying that's good, but that's generally where you find it. But most soils are deficient in copper. But once you correct that copper, I've got clients that we started with in the 1970s that corrected their copper, and they've never had to put it on again. Because copper is so slow at breaking down. I don't know how long it's going to be. But, you know, from 1978 until now, and you put on what copper you need and it still maintains, it's not a mistake. Because once that copper starts to drop, it starts dropping quickly. But when we start looking at applying various nutrients, how much copper does it take? You can put on 5 pounds of copper sulfate on a copper deficient soil and put that on at planting time on potatoes, come in and measure the leaf of those potatoes at bloom, and that copper is already in those potatoes. You can have part that you don't do it and part where you do. The part that got the copper, that's already in. Now, what's the mystery about that? When you put 5 pounds of copper sulfate in to spread, that means when you spread it, you got a little blue stone over here, a little blue stone over here, a little blue stone over here. It's not even going to be close to those potatoes many times. But you can take leaf samples from any of those potatoes, and they've already got that copper. How does that happen? You have to have the life in the soil to move that around. And you know what? Our bodies do the same thing. When you get copper into your body, you don't have to put the copper right where you have the inflammation. All you have to do is get the right form of copper into your body to fight inflammation. And it just so happens, that's why a lot of people will wear an old piece of copper or whatever. It just so happens that pure copper combined with human perspiration is exactly the form of copper you need to fight inflammation of muscle and bone. Pure copper combined with human perspiration. If you wonder about whether you got pure copper or not, here's the thing. I'll just caution you because sometimes you can give people the wrong idea. Don't go out here and get a piece of a copper wire that you use for electrical and say, well, I'm going to beat that into a bracelet or something, because it has lead in it to make it malleable. You want pure 100% copper when you're taking that copper to fight rust, to fight inflammation in your body. But if we have less than 2 parts per million copper, our plants are not getting the minimal amount of copper. If you're going wheat, 2 parts per million is enough. Many other crops, 2 parts per million is enough to fight rust and fungus disease. But if you're going raspberries or blackberries, your copper level has to get to 12 to 15 parts per million before it stops rust in blackberries and raspberries. It takes more copper. The more what I'm trying to say, when you ship it, the easier, the more perishable, that's the word I'm trying to think of. The more perishable, the more copper it takes. Well, we're not getting very far here. I've talked about the potatoes in terms of the copper. Copper levels in tomatoes, if you're less than 2 parts per million copper and you're growing tomatoes in your garden, it's going to get splits right up there around the stem. When they start turning red, if you've got splits right up there top around the stem, if you're growing grape and it splits at the stem, you have less than 2 parts per million copper. Now, there could be some other problems that will get blamed for that, but until you correct the copper, you don't collect those splits. Because copper is necessary for stalk strength and skin strength and resilience, to be able to stretch and not break, or to be able to bend and not break. Sulfur for root and trunk growth, we talked about that yesterday. We need 50 parts per million of sulfur in our garden if we want to get good root growth. That's what will maximize, get 30% more roots from it. Fertilizing trees to withstand drought, potassium and zinc are the same keys for those trees that it is for what you're growing in your garden. At least 2% potassium and at least 6 parts per million zinc on the test we're using. Vines and trees need potassium for water uptake and to build strong wood. If you want stronger wood in terms of any type of a woody plant, get your potassium up between 7 and 7.5%. That's the first thing we talk about to people that are growing grapes, whether it's raisin grapes, table grapes, wine grapes. Get that potassium up between 7 and 7.5. Not only do they have the strongest wood, but that's when they'll have the highest quality in terms of the juice or the wines or whatever that's made. Proper fertility, not too little or too much, optimizes soil life, yields, quality, and profits. And I appreciate your attention as far as that goes. I'll just say that we do soil tests for many, many gardens, and a lot of people will say, well, you know, what you present, that's for big farm. Well, we do, what we find is, if you got one flower pot, the same principles work as it does if you got a huge operation. And if you're growing fruit trees or landscape trees or flowers or bananas or blueberries or alfalfa, it really takes the same nutrients to grow them all. Why do people say, oh, you don't need as much for this or as much for that? Because some plant, it's a good thing. Some plants will stand a whole lot less of one thing, and some plants will stand a whole lot less of something else and still grow. Does that mean they're the best? No, it means they're growing, and we at least got something there. If we had to have perfect soil, a lot of us wouldn't have much food. Because when we look at soils, almost all soils are lacking in terms of just what we know how to measure. Something. I don't look for faults. I like to look for soils that say, you've done everything you need to do, and that's fine. I don't think Joel will mind me telling this, but Joel said a neighbor of his came to him and said, well, you know, we need to do some soils. And Joel told him about our soil testing service. And the neighbor came to him later and said, could I send 4 of your soils and act like they're mine? So Joel gave him 4, let him send 4 soils. And when those came back, Joel said, he brought them over to me and said, these 4 soils say you don't need anything. That was Joel's soil. All his soils were on worn out soils. Well, when you start looking at a soil test, if you do a good job of sampling, the soil tests don't lie. The real key that we are worried about most is make sure you pull the sample properly, and anyone that contacts our office, you can get online, www.kinseyag.com, and we've got the instructions there. I see I'm already past, I gotta quit. Thanks very much, and I appreciate it.